I'm about to tell you something that might be hard to believe, but it's true. It might sound too strange to be true, but it actually happened to me. I can tell you from my own experience that reality can be stranger than fiction. I've never been one to dwell on the unexpected. I like things to be straightforward and practical. I ran my household with a strict sense of order, and I expected the same from my wife. We had our roles clearly defined, and I saw no reason to complicate things unnecessarily. I thought my life was simple. My wife, on the other hand, was a different story. She was always on the lookout for something new. She was always on the lookout for something new and exciting to fill her time. She wasn't happy with the status quo and needed to feel like she was part of something bigger. At first, I assumed it was just her nature. She had a restless energy and a need for change that I didn't fully understand, but I was willing to tolerate it. She liked to get involved in different social groups, always trying to find a place where she felt comfortable. She was pleasant, polite, and eager to make friends. I figured it was just her personality, as long as she got her responsibilities at home done. I had no complaints at the time, but looking back, I realize now. Later on, I came to understand that there was something else going on. It seemed like she was trying to fill a kind of emptiness. She wanted to feel interesting, to have something to talk about, something that made her stand out. At the time, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just another passing interest. I couldn't have imagined what was to come. I had my own interests and I was happy with them. I didn't dwell on how our differences played out in that regard. But I would soon realize that the differences between us were much more significant than I had ever imagined. Even my wife seemed a bit down when she came home from work. She seemed a bit off, and I could tell something was on her mind. I asked what the problem was. She sat down at the kitchen counter and started chatting about her colleagues. She said they all had these fascinating hobbies. Some were into tennis, others golf, and a few even did pottery. They always had something to talk about, whether it was their weekends or the new skills they were learning. She said she felt out of place because she didn't have anything like that to offer. I listened to them and got interested. Sure, I feel comfortable in the group, but I want to be more than just a listener. I want to be the one with something interesting to say for once. She went on to say that she wanted a hobby of her own, something unique that would make her feel alive, something different from what her colleagues were doing. I listened to her with a bit of a bored expression at first. From my experience, trouble always starts the same way with a woman with too much time on her hands. I figured this was another case of that, but I didn't write her off completely. She seemed genuinely bothered. So I nodded and told her we'd figure something out. It wouldn't hurt to look into a few options if it would help her get out of it. I already knew that finding this special hobby wouldn't be easy. I'd seen her lose interest in things before, moving quickly from one activity to the next. This time, though, she seemed set on making it happen. She really needed something to focus on. I decided to humor her. Perhaps it would be beneficial for her to have something to focus on. I suggested that it might be helpful for her to have something to focus on. I said I'd ask around to see if any of my colleagues or acquaintances had ideas, and we could also look online. She seemed pleased that I was willing to help. I think she thought I understood what she was going through, but honestly, I just wanted to help her find something so she wouldn't complain about it anymore. I kept an eye on her that evening, wondering if this was just another phase, or if she was genuinely feeling lost. Either way, I figured it was worth finding her something to do after all, if she was busy with her own interests. I figured she'd be less likely to get restless and bring that energy into her home. I offered to help her find this hobby she was so keen on at work during our breaks. I started asking my colleagues if they or their wives had any interesting hobbies. I wasn't really used to these kinds of conversations. I figured it was worth the effort if it meant getting my wife off my back. Some of the guys mentioned fishing, painting, or even learning a musical instrument. I made a note of all the suggestions and thought I'd run them by her later in the day. I sat down with her, and we went over some of the options. We even checked out some classes and activities in our area online. It felt a little strange for me sitting there browsing through pottery workshops, yoga sessions, and cooking classes. It wasn't really my thing, and I have to admit, I wasn't that into any of it. But she seemed optimistic, and I was determined to find something that would keep her engaged. Ultimately, I enrolled her in a few of these classes. One was a pottery workshop that a few of my colleagues' wives suggested. She seemed pretty excited about it at first. She went to the classes and came home saying how relaxing it was to work with clay. She even brought back a few pieces she made. I figured, maybe this will do the trick for a few weeks. Everything was going well. She seemed happy, and I thought we'd finally found something that worked. As I had half expected, she soon started to lose interest. One evening, she came home and told me that she said the pottery wasn't what she was looking for. She felt like she was just going along with the crowd, doing something anyone could do. She was looking for something more unique and something that would stand out. At that moment, I realized we were back to square one. Despite all that effort, we still hadn't found what she wanted. She wasn't one to give up easily. I suggested a few more options, like painting classes and outdoor hiking clubs. She gave those a try at first, and she came back with some great stories. But eventually, she lost interest and said, "It's just not it." I was starting to feel a bit frustrated. No matter what we tried, it seemed like nothing would satisfy her. Nevertheless, I persisted, determined to find something that would keep her engaged. It was only a matter of time before she either found what she was looking for or realized that this quest for uniqueness was pointless. Either way, I was determined to see this through to the end, if only to put an end to her complaints once and for all. I've never been one to get caught up in hobbies like my wife. I had my own way of unwinding, playing computer games with my friends, grabbing a drink at the bar every now and then, and maybe watching a match or two on TV. It was straightforward, and it worked for me. I didn't feel the need to impress anyone or find some activity to stand out. I was happy with what I had and never felt the need to be more interesting or unique. That kind of thinking just wasn't my style. One night, I was checking out some videos on TikTok, which I do from time to time. When I wasn't otherwise occupied, I wasn't actively seeking anything in particular, just passing the time as I scrolled through the videos. One video in particular caught my eye. A woman riding a horse to the tune of "Be My Lover." She was moving really gracefully in sync with the music, and she was pretty flashy. I paused for a moment to watch. As she rode with confidence, the horse responding to her every move, it looked really exhilarating. I thought to myself, that's a different approach. I had a thought. I knew my wife had been on the lookout for something exciting and unique, and this seemed like it might fit the bill. Riding isn't something you see every day, and it's definitely not like tennis or pottery. It was a bit of a thrill, and it might give her that sense of excitement she was after. I thought it was worth a try when I mentioned it to her. She was really interested and asked me more about it. I showed her the video, and she was really impressed. The woman looked so alive, riding with confidence and style. My wife was immediately on board with the idea. She said it was exactly what she was looking for. She didn't waste any time and started looking for horseback riding lessons nearby. It felt like we might have found something that would actually work within days. She found a place that offered lessons and signed up. She was keen to get started. She was more enthusiastic than I'd seen in a long time. She kept saying how different it was from anything she tried before. She was really excited and couldn't wait to tell her colleagues all about it. I thought, maybe this time we've found something that'll really take off. It was great to see her so enthusiastic, even if I wasn't totally sure what it was about it that she liked. I wasn't sure if it would last, but I was hopeful at the very least. It seemed like horseback riding was what she was looking for. She was looking for something exciting and unique, so I figured it was better than her moping around. If it kept her engaged, then it was worth the effort. I watched her head off to her first lesson, thinking that this might be the thing to finally settle her restless spirit. After her first lesson, my wife came home with a newfound enthusiasm. She came home with a newfound enthusiasm that I hadn't seen in a long time. She was absolutely beaming, practically glowing with excitement. As soon as she walked in the door, she couldn't stop talking. She couldn't stop talking about how amazing it felt to ride the horse and how powerful and free she felt being up there. She told me about the way the horse moved beneath her, the thrill of the wind against her face, and how it felt like a completely new experience. She said her colleagues were really supportive and impressed when she told them she was taking up horseback riding. They were really supportive and said it was a pretty bold move. Unlike the usual hobbies people take up, she seemed genuinely happy that she'd found something that set her apart from the rest. It was evident that she had finally discovered her niche, a quality that set her apart from her peers. She said it felt good to be the one with the interesting story for a while. It was a welcome change of pace. For the next few weeks, it was all she could talk about at work. She was always keen to share the details of her lessons with anyone who would listen. She told me about how she was learning to control the horse, the new techniques the instructor showed her, and even how she had started to bond with the animal. She was practically bursting with excitement. It was a nonstop flow of stories. While I wasn't particularly interested, I let her talk as long as she was happy and engaged. That was all I needed to know. About a month later, her enthusiasm started to wane. She stuck with it, unlike the other hobbies she had tried before. She seemed genuinely invested this time. She was always looking forward to her next lesson. It was as if she had become obsessed with it. Her schedule was all about these lessons. I thought we'd finally found something that would stick. She even started picking up new gear, riding boots, a helmet, and other things she said were necessary. I was fine with it as long as it kept her motivated and excited. It was worth it. Plus, she seemed more confident and more alive for a moment. I thought this might be what she'd been missing all along. Maybe this was what she needed to feel like she was all set. I was just happy to see her. It was nice to have some peace in the house without her complaining about feeling bored or left out. I didn't get the appeal of riding, but as long as it kept her busy and happy, I was game. It seemed, at least for now, that horseback riding was exactly what she needed. One evening, my wife went out to meet a friend of hers. They often got together to chat, catch up, and gossip about the usual things women talk about. I didn't pay much attention to these meetups. They were just part of her routine. But that evening, she sent me a message. She sent me a message out of the blue saying, "I have something to tell you later. You're not going to believe this." I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured it was just some silly story she picked up from her friend when she got home. She was really excited, like she was waiting to tell a joke that she thought was really funny. She kicked off her shoes and dove right in, barely taking a breath. She told me that her friend had recently purchased a sex toy, but not just any kind. It was shaped like a horse's genitals. She made a point of emphasizing how big it was, gesturing with her hands to show. She laughed about how absurd it all seemed. She said her friend showed it to her as a joke, and they both laughed about it, wondering who would even buy something like that. "Isn't that crazy?" she said, still laughing. "How do people even use these things?" She seemed amused by the whole situation, treating it as a bit of light-hearted humor between friends. It was just a bit of light-hearted humor between friends. I couldn't help but laugh, but it was more out of awkwardness than anything else. It was a pretty unusual topic, even for her. I made a quick joke to break the ice, something like, "Well, that's wild. Some people really are into some pretty strange things." I didn't think much of it beyond that. In my mind, it was just another one of those odd things people do that didn't affect us. We laughed it off and I moved on, not dwelling on it further. After all, what did it have to do with us? It was just another one of her friend's unusual stories she kept mentioning. We spent a few more minutes laughing, but I could see she was almost fascinated by the absurdity of it all. She asked me if I could ever imagine someone actually using something like that. I gave a shrug and told her it was beyond my comprehension. "People are strange," I said, keeping my tone casual. As far as I was concerned, it was just another harmless joke between friends. It was just a strange topic of conversation that would be forgotten by the next day. Once we'd finished laughing, we moved on to other things, and I didn't think much more about the story after that. It seemed like just another harmless joke between friends, nothing to get too worked up about. It seemed like people were willing to try anything for a thrill these days. I had no idea this seemingly innocent conversation would come to mean something else later on. At the time, though, I had no reason to think there was anything unusual going on. Not long after that conversation, I noticed my wife acting differently. She started spending more time at the stables, staying later than she used to. At first, I didn't think much of it. She was really into her new hobby, and I figured it was only natural for her to want to immerse herself in it. But after a while, I noticed that the frequency and length of her visits were increasing. She'd let me know she was going to be there. I asked her if she needed help or if she wanted to practice a bit more, but there was something about the way she said it that didn't sit right with me. I tried asking her about the lessons like I used to, but she didn't give me as much detail as she used to. Before I knew it, she was chatting nonstop about her time at the stables and sharing every little detail about her progress. When I asked her about the horses she was working with now, she'd just shrug and say it was fine or nothing special. It was as if she wasn't interested in discussing it further. I couldn't help but feel like she was hiding something, and that feeling started to bug me. I thought maybe she'd met someone there, another rider, or perhaps one of the instructors. I'd seen it happen before with other people. They get caught up in a new hobby, meet someone who shares their passion, and things move quickly from there. It was the only logical explanation at the time. If she was being secretive, it meant she was trying to hide something from me. I'm not one to jump to conclusions, but there were some signs there that I couldn't ignore. I kept these thoughts to myself, but I started paying closer attention to her behavior. When she got back, she was always on her phone, and she seemed a bit distant, like her mind was elsewhere. It felt like she was gradually distancing herself from me. I didn't appreciate being kept in the dark. I was a bit suspicious, but I wanted to be sure before I confronted her. If there was something going on, I needed proof, not just a feeling. I came up with a plan. One evening when she told me she'd be staying late again, I decided to drive to the stables myself. I didn't let her in on it. I wanted to see for myself what was really going on. If she was hiding something or someone, I was going to find out. I thought I'd park a bit further away and walk over quietly. It was the only way to confirm what I thought might be going on. The idea of having to do this felt absurd. I never thought I'd be the type to do that. I needed to check in on my wife, but her behavior made it clear that I had to do it myself. I needed to find out if I was right in my suspicions. If she was being unfaithful, at least I'd have the truth and I could decide what to do next. With that in mind, I headed out that evening, determined to finally get to the bottom of what was really going on. I parked at the stables and left my car a bit away from the entrance so I wouldn't be noticed. I stepped out and made my way quietly, trying to stay out of the way as much as possible. The place was pretty dark, with just a few lights on, and it was pretty quiet, except for the odd rustle of hay or a horse shifting. In her stall, I was nervous and my mind was racing with possibilities. I was ready to see her with someone else, braced for the worst, but nothing could have prepared me for what I actually saw. As I got closer, I heard faint noises coming from one of the stalls. I walked slowly and stayed silent until I had a clear view. And that's when I saw her. She was completely naked, standing next to the horse. I was frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. She was interacting with the animal in ways that were difficult for me to understand. Her hands moved in a way that felt strangely familiar, making my skin crawl. She rubbed herself against the horse, and I felt my stomach turn. It was a pretty out there sight, something I couldn't have imagined. My eyes widened, and I stood there for a moment, unable to react. All I could think was, this is worse. It had been a romantic interest, which would have been understandable. I could have handled that rationally. But this was something else. I felt a surge of anger and disgust, and I just couldn't take it any longer. I stepped forward and called her name, my voice echoing through the quiet stable. She jumped and quickly tried to cover herself, reaching for her clothes. "This isn't what it seems," I said. She yelled, her voice shaking a bit. She looked afraid, like she knew she'd been involved in something she didn't want to be. But I wasn't interested in what she had to say to explain herself. There was no way to explain this, and no words could justify what I had just seen. I didn't say anything else at the time. I just turned on my heel and headed back to the car. Her footsteps echoed with anger and disgust as she followed me, pleading and trying to explain. But it was too late for that. I wasn't interested in hearing it. I knew whatever she was going to say wouldn't change anything. I couldn't unsee what I'd seen, and I knew there was no going back. By the time I got to the car, I was shaking hands and fumbled with the key. I could still hear her shouting behind me, but I didn't turn back. I got into the car, closed the door, and drove away. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I needed to get away to put as much distance between myself and that awful scene as possible. I don't think there was any way to undo what I'd done. When I got home, I was pretty mad. I was so shaken up that I couldn't even think straight. I knew I needed to get away from the house. I went straight to our bedroom and started packing her things. Clothes, shoes, anything that belonged to her. I didn't care about making a mess. I just wanted to get rid of everything she owned. The rage that had built up on the drive home wasn't going away, and seeing her things around the room only made it worse. Before long, I heard her car pull up outside. I knew she'd followed me back, but I didn't look up. "Hey, wait a minute," she said, coming through the door. Her face was still pale and looked panicked. "What are you doing?" she asked, but I didn't respond. I kept throwing her stuff out bag by bag. My main priority was to get her out of my sight. I was still thinking about the scene from the stables. Just looking at her was enough to make my head spin. She tried to explain herself, reaching out to grab my arm. "Listen, it's not what you think," she said, her voice desperate. "It's a procedure for the horse they needed for breeding." I paused for a moment, looking at her, and then let out a short, bitter laugh. I was pretty shocked. "You had to be naked to do that." I told her that her explanation didn't make sense, and that I was even angrier that she was trying to justify it. She looked down, her eyes moving quickly as she tried to find the right words. "I thought it would be easier that way," she said, almost in a whisper, as if she knew how absurd it sounded, that it's supposed to help calm the horse. I was floored. It was like she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince me. I shook my head, my hands clenching into fists. "Do you really think I'm going to believe that? You think I'm not smart enough to understand this?" I brushed past her, tossing another bag of her things onto the floor. "I don't know if I'm more upset that you did that or that you're lying to my face right now." She started crying, but I wasn't moved. At that moment, her tears meant nothing to me. I was just thinking about how messed up the whole situation was and how she'd managed to get me involved. She kept saying she didn't know what else to do and that she'd panicked when I walked in. She said, "I didn't want you to see me like that," as if that made any difference. It was too late for that. I'd already seen everything, and there was no way to erase it. I felt like I was stuck in a nightmare, one I couldn't wake up from. The more she tried to explain, the more frustrated I became. Her excuses were just that, excuses. They didn't change what she did, which was still pretty gross. I kept on packing her things. I ignored her sobs and her attempts to grab my arm. I had heard enough. I was no longer interested in what she had to say. She'd gone too far to be able to take it back. She betrayed me in a way I never thought was possible. As far as I was concerned, our relationship was over. I stood there looking at her, feeling nothing but anger and disgust. Before I could even think them through, I blurted out, "How could you betray me like that with a horse of all things?" I yelled, and my voice echoed through the room. I was surprised at myself for saying it, but the truth was I find it even harder to believe that you chose a horse over your husband. Do you realize how crazy that sounds? She flinched at my words, but I didn't care. There was no way to make sense of what she had done. She tried to get closer, reaching out as if to touch my arm, but I stepped back, not letting her. "Don't even try to get close to me. I'm not interested in hearing your excuses. You think you can explain this away, but there's nothing you can say that'll make this okay." Her tears kept flowing, and she kept shaking her head, repeating that it wasn't what it looked like. But it was too late for excuses. I had seen it. I saw it happen, and there was nothing I could do to change what had already taken place. How could you choose something like that over me? I carried on, my voice getting louder. I've heard of infidelity, but this is beyond anything I could have imagined. I could feel my hand shaking with anger. You really embarrassed me in front of everyone. I'm not sure how to put it into words. Do you have any idea what you've done? I could see the guilt and fear in her eyes, but it didn't matter anymore. There was no going back from this. She kept saying it was just a procedure, that it was for the horse's benefit, for the horse's sake, but her words felt hollow. It seemed like she was trying to find a way out of the situation. "Is that your excuse?" I replied that this was necessary for the horse and that you thought being naked was the best solution. "Do you even realize what you're saying?" I could see she was desperate, but every word she spoke only made me angrier. I was pretty annoyed, to be honest. She was trying to make it sound innocent, but it was anything but. I just wanted to get away from the situation. I didn't want to hear any more false information. I told her to pack her things and leave. She started to plead, saying she was sorry. She tried to explain, but I was done. I wasn't going to stand there and listen to any more of her nonsense. The betrayal was too deep and too raw. There was no way to make this work. I took her bags and handed them to her as she cried, still trying to make me listen. "You gave up your marriage for something that doesn't even make sense. Take a moment to think about it." I was surprised to have to say those words, but they were true. As I was pushing her out the door, she looked back at me through the door, still crying and trying to reach me, and she begged, "Please let me explain." But I didn't give her a chance to explain. "It's over," I said, closing the door behind her. "You made your choice," I added, listening to her footsteps fade away. I was still trying to make sense of everything, but there was no logic to be found. What she did was so out of line that I knew there was no way she could make me understand otherwise. As I expected, the divorce process was cold and clinical once I had thrown her out. It was clear that there was no way back. The next day, I began the formalities and hired a lawyer. There was no point in dragging things out. I knew what I had seen, and there was no reason to pretend that we could reconcile. It felt like we were just passing each other in the hall. We were no longer connected. She tried to reach out a few times, sending messages and asking if we could talk, but I didn't respond. I had nothing more to say on the matter. The betrayal was too deep, and I wasn't interested in hearing any more excuses. My lawyer made it clear that it was. We decided to keep things straightforward. There was no need to make a fuss or complicate things. We decided that the sooner we could wrap things up, the better it would be for both of us. We filed for a no-fault divorce, and the paperwork was processed pretty quickly. We didn't have any children, so there were no custody issues to worry about. The only things we needed to divide were our assets, which was pretty straightforward. She'd already moved out, and most of her stuff was gone. We agreed on how to split our savings and the house without much fuss. It seemed like she was ready to move on. I was grateful that things were handled discreetly. I really didn't want to make a scene. I didn't tell anyone at work or among my friends the real reason for our divorce. I just said that we'd grown apart. It was just easier that way. I didn't want their pity or judgment. Above all, I didn't want to damage her reputation. Despite everything she'd done, I figured there was no point in making her life any worse. Maybe one day she'd think about her actions and realize that. Once the divorce was final, I was focused on moving on with my life. I got back to work and my usual routines. I went out with friends and kept busy, trying not to dwell on what had happened. It was a challenge, though. There were times when I thought about what I'd seen. Sometimes I'd feel that same wave of disgust, but I did my best to push it aside. She was no longer in my life, and that chapter was closed. I had no idea how she was doing, as far as I knew. She relocated to a different part of the city, and we haven't had any further contact since. I heard from mutual acquaintances that she was trying to keep her life together, but I didn't ask for details. I wasn't interested in finding out how things were going for her. As far as I was concerned, we were done, and it was best to leave it at that. Ultimately, I knew that getting a divorce was the right decision. It gave us both the chance to move forward, even if it meant going our separate ways. She'd made her choice and I'd made mine. Given everything that happened, it was clear that we weren't meant to be together. Maybe she'll think about what she did and learn from it, but for now, we're on different paths, and I'm not looking back.